everyone. We are 1 week into this Venus retrograde period, Venus in Gemini squaring Neptune. And what I'm called to speak to is something that I'm really noticing in myself and in my environment. It's so easy to... One of the issues within Gemini is reactivity. Not reactivity in terms of like Mars, Aries reactivity, but reactivity in terms of mental reactivity. The mental reactivity can be stimuli, reaction, right? You're talking to someone and then, we do this, other people do this, one thought enters and that thought creates and leads you down a trail for another thought, where relationship with others can easily become oh yeah, that makes me think of this, and I'll say this. And also our inner dialogue. Venus in Gemini can be this grasping for perspective and clarity and logic, trying to piece together our life, our value, our worth, our relationships, trying to put everything in some kind of context that can make sense. And in that striving, there's a psychology of possessiveness where the mind can just be reactive. And so there's stimulation, there's information, and Venus, there's sensation. We feel something. And instead of listening, the tendency, a common pattern with Venus and Gemini, is to react, to act on the mental impulse. To give it an analogy, it's like, sitting in the kitchen and you have a craving for sugar, so you eat sugar. And then you have a craving for hydration, so you take apple juice. And then you want something salty, so you eat saltines. And it's almost like this never-ending pattern of reactivity. And imagine applying that to how we are in relationship to one another. You said this to me, and now I'm going to react to that. And again, this reaction isn't necessarily a violent reaction or harsh reaction. It's just a reaction that happens in the mind. And so what's often lost in Venus and Gemini is a stillness and a consideration. That's one of the lessons in Gemini, is to really learn the difference between response versus reaction. Where response is integrating the information. When we apply it into Venus, into the sphere of relationship, it's feeling. It's connecting with, how does that feel in my body? Is this comfortable? Is this balanced? So in Venus and Gemini, the exchanges and the information, the dialogue can actually be very dynamic and interesting and move in many directions. But for it to not be chaotic, we learn to go slow. We learn to relax the mind and the nervous system that wants to jump. And so what can be very confusing, and I would say disillusioning, during this period, and as I make this video, Venus and Neptune are a day or so away from their first exact square during this retrograde period. And they're going to be in an exact square at the very end, after Venus goes direct in a couple months, when it returns to where it is now. So to really consider the theme in your life, the relationships, the way in which we're interacting with one another, the kinds of conversations that are happening, and the themes of self-value, self-worth, agreements, exchange. Gemini isn't just communication, it's also, you go to the market, you're exchanging goods. Anything that involves exchanging of data or information or instruments or things. And so through the exchange of any kind of variable, there is an increase of perspective, an increase of experience. If I have a possession and I give you this possession, it's now a new context in your life. Everything that we exchange from the perspective of Gemini is new information, new data. And of course, the most practical application of that is our words, which reflects our thinking, which here reflects our values. And the stories and the thoughts and the logical arguments and context that we'll create and offer to one another reflects our value. And it points back to the way in which we are all conditioned and behaviorally familiar with affirming and relating to our own selves. It says, this is how I find my self-worth. This is how I establish my self-esteem. This is how I find value inside of myself. And what can be confusing during this time, especially as Venus and Neptune really tighten into the square, is a total loss of perspective. Because the interface between Gemini and Pisces says, you don't have all the pieces. Your reactive mind is deriving from a striving to find self-value, find balance in the next thought. And so it can actually create a mess of perspectives, possible ways of looking at things, arguments, conversations that almost get bigger and more complex and more, convoluted the more you go into it. And so the Neptune and Pisces piece really says, you don't have the answer. You don't know why this person's in your life. You don't know what the exchange really is. Neptune says the true exchange, the true value, the true purpose of every relationship is the return to love. And the true function of every relationship is forgiveness. With a forgiven mind, a mind that is at peace with itself, it isn't seeking to fix something or change something, to use more thought, to apply more perspective, entertain more possibilities to solve the problems. There's a grace, a providence that actually wants to lead the way. And I think there's a period on this journey, and this is very much now, where in the beginning of this retrograde period, we're just opening this window. And so it's very reasonable to understand that there is more to see. There's a lot to learn here. And so the theme here would be humility, surrender, and sort of realizing, wow, when I try to do this myself, when I try to engage my own thinking, when I think that I can create harmony and balance, when I think that I can determine and decide what I am and what you are and what we are and how it's going to go and how it's going to work. I forgot what the beginning of my sentence was, but you get the idea. And Michelle, do you have anything that you want to share on this?
Yeah, I think it's interesting in this particular time period that as Venus stationed retrograde, Mercury is also in Gemini. So the amplification of this ability to communicate and to communicate quickly, it's like, and for thought to move into action and for conversation to, like the way you were talking about, that we can like live out our delusions that much faster.
Yeah.
And what'll be interesting to see is that actually when Venus stations direct and moves back and makes the next square with Neptune, I'm pretty sure by then Mercury has already moved into Cancer and will be retrograde. So we go from retrograde Venus in relationship to Mercury moving quickly and maybe not knowing the full truth of our own worth, from which then we're acting in old patterns, acting in old ways, and all the healing that can happen when we slow down, when we recognize like, wow, I'm living this thought pattern, I'm like going with it without question, like the simplicity of stopping and questioning what's really happening, what I think is going on, and tuning into the larger purpose, which we don't know. We really don't know why everything is what it is. and it's often like hindsight, right? But in this particular time, there's a lot of potency for coming to know our own self-worth and self-love in a much deeper way, and that the mind can quickly integrate new information, new ways of thinking, new ways of acting. And then when Mercury moves into Cancer, the square, in my sense, will be much more emotionally attuned and feeling oriented. Right now it's way more about what we think is happening versus actually what we feel is happening, and where our worth comes from how we think about ourselves versus worth that comes from how we actually feel about ourselves. And so the subtle difference of how this will be later on in the retrograde cycle.
Venus is also a thing, right? Venus is thingness. It's physical. It's body. It's other. It's very physical. And Neptune is nothing. Like, everything comes from nothing. Neptune is nothing. Neptune is the void. Neptune is the emptiness. It's like the infinite void and source from which all things come. And that's like sort of the cosmic trick with Neptune, that all the physicalness that we see came from nothing. That emptiness is the starting point. And it was almost like we're not going to find fullness by adding more thought upon thought. It's like spraying a spray over a spray over a spray. And so to allow the unwinding. Thank you.
Thank you.